Good evening, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and it's Monday night, and it's Mindfields tonight. So I'll be veering into a couple of different subjects tonight. The topic really is more about synarchism and seeing how deeply it has ensconced itself into us from World War II to now. Of course, the idea of synarchism existed a long time before World War II, but you see how it works its way into the present. When we work through the lives of someone like a Henry Kissinger, who's obviously still a factor. The equal inherit the mirth. I like that, Charles. Hello. Hello, Robert. Miss Hunt, Gary. Corky's here, and Debbie's here. Hi, Debbie, Polly, and everyone else. Let's see, we have 19 people registered on the counter up there. That's good. And settle in for a second. Got a couple things to read tonight. Who is McCloy? Who is John McCloy? Well, he was one of the most important lawyers that was working for the Rockefellers, and he's the guy that set up a lot of this stuff. So we'll be touching on him at the beginning of the show. Corky, I appreciate that nice drawing, etching you did for me. I have it in my office. Very nice. Really nice to get to meet you. I hope we'll see each other again sometime soon, maybe in the spring. Yeah, I miss everybody. I like having the charrettes, and maybe if people want to, we can figure out a way to get together this spring somehow. Mm. By the way, you like this coffee cup? Isn't that nice? Well, they're going to be available within a couple of days on our website. We've got the link hooked up now, and Jumping Mouse is putting a link on the website. So pretty soon you will have the opportunity to get your very own Screaming Ospreys mug. They're very nice. They're thin, they're just the right thickness, and keep your ginger tea nice and warm. 24 and rising. Okay. Charles is get a bad rap. Charles Willoughby will be on our on deck tonight if we get to him. He's one of the ones that I think is going to get a really bad rap. His name is Willoughby in English, or Weidenbach, which is his real name in German. I think the main theme tonight is how the Rockefellers were running everything on, I mean, both the Pacific War and the Mediterranean War. And okay, well, we've got 25 people here. Let's go ahead and get started. The first reading is from a book called Virtual Government. Hang on a second. Virtual Government, CIA Mind Control Operations in America. And need to go to page 7 here. Okay, so I'm going to start in, all of this is quite worthwhile, but let's start in with McCloy, the real McCloy. I'm just going to read that to you since the print's kind of small. Meanwhile, backstage at the war crimes show trials, Rockefeller counsel John J. McCloy, the High Commissioner of Germany, parentheses, later a High Commissioner of the JFK murder investigation, in other words, on the Warren Commission, courted Nazi officials on behalf of the U.S. government. Defendant Gustav Krupp once controlled 138 private concentration camps utilizing slave labor. Yet the German industrialist was permitted to hold board meetings with executives of the Krupp business empire while still a prisoner at Nuremberg. McCloy freed Krupp and kindly returned the munition builder's property. The CIA banker also assembled a panel chaired by David Peck, leading justice of the New York Supreme Court, to, quote, review the sentences of Germans wanted for recruitment by the Allies. Otto Skorzeny, Krupp's representative in Argentina, Hitler's very own commando, was among the first German spies surreptitiously placed on the American Cold War intelligence dole. On January 19, 1953, the New York Times took notice, quote, Nazism is not dead in Germany. Given time and opportunity, quote, a form of Nazism could again rise to power. Materially speaking, Nazism was smashed into a pulp by 1945, but the vigorous roots remained, unquote. A national priority was made of economic recovery in the fatherland. A memo from the German press department of B'nai B'rith to officials of the Jewish organization on July 1st, 1953, detailed a meeting of the former Waffen SS in Verdun, once a Nazi garrison town. Quote, the reason this little alumni club exists is, one might say, plausible, even sentimental, to care for those in their ranks who survived and to locate lost comrades. The reunion, the first since the war, brought 5,000 men to Verdun, mufti clad. They marched through cramped, flag-bedecked streets to the rally with all their famous and former military precision. Among their contacts in the United States, the Nazi elite could rely on the generous assistance of a patron, Pedro del Valle, or Valle, I guess it's Spanish, Pedro del Valle, who went on to become a vice president of IT&T. Now, I have to stop and say IT&T once again, because if you remember from trading with the enemy, and I've emphasized it a number of times now, IT&T was this international corporation that ran the telephones and other communications for all the parties in World War II. And, they even gave the Pope a gold telephone. They are the, the George Webb's Blackberries of 1944. No, they are the ones that are listening in on everything. So if you're looking for the synarchy, let's put IT&T right at the top of the list, and their uh, um, corporate director, Sothsenus Bain, Behatn, a man of Dutch and Greek, of Danish and Greek um, heritage, but somebody obviously that's an internationalist who's working for some undisclosed parties. So, Del Valle, a retired Marine Corps lieutenant general, was soundly defeated in his bid for the Republican gubernatorial nomination. His campaign was spiced with public endorsements of a foaming anti Semitic booklet, Know Your Enemy. In 1974, Del Valle and ITT and consultant John McCone, formerly a CIA director, threw in to overthrow Allende in Chile's 1970 coup. IT&T funneled some $350,000 into the elections, and when the brutal dictatorship of Pinochet was installed, conspired with other politically conservative companies to pirate the country's natural resources. As a hedge against the fall of the Third Reich, German industrialists made provisions in 1944 for protecting their loot from confiscation by the US and England on the instructions of Martin Bormann. The surviving SS, now Odessa, established hundreds of corporations abroad, donated handsomely to far right political candidates, and cleared the path for the reconstruction of the Reich on foreign soil. All of this was accomplished by channeling the loot through a labyrinth of secret bank accounts. The funds were transferred to non belligerent nations and, under Bormann's direction, financed some 750 new companies to oversee the Nazi Party's revival. Over 100 of those companies were in the United States. Funds materialized in the accounts of Germany's agents around the world. They were instructed to invest in selected businesses and propaganda fronts in the US and elsewhere, channel legitimate legal aid to indicted Nazis, purchase out of the way estates for Nazi leaders in foreign countries, and so on. These funds also supported the rat lines, ports of call situated every 40 miles along the German border for Nazis fleeing the Allied noose. In December 1946, a memorandum from Lawrence Frank, the U.S. consul in Austria, was sent to the State Department noting that Goering and Goebbels had moved funds to Geneva in diplomatic bags to avoid detection. Quote, it's reported that Reichsmarschall Goering lately used this method to transfer personal funds. Goering sent more than $20 million of his personal fortune to Argentina. He shipped some of this fortune via submarine in the summer of 1943. Goebbels secreted $1.3 million in a safety deposit box in Buenos Aires. The Times of London reported on December 6, 1996, that the Nazis secretly sent more than $1 billion to Argentina in the last month of the war and scoured the world for sanctuaries for their plundered wealth. Reactionary opinions in the United States Reactionary opinion in the United States was fomented by American Nazis. For America, a spin off of the America First Committee, that's for America, to capital letters, a spin off of the America First Committee was formed in 1954, steered by leading World War II isolationists. One of the organization's statutarian spokesman was Colonel Robert McCormick, publisher of the Chicago Tribune. The chairman of For America was Clarence Mannion, former dean of law at Notre Dame University. Mannion once sat on Eisenhower's Commission on Intergovernmental Affairs. Robert Wood, then CEO of Sears Roebuck, was a ramrod leader of the Bund. The stated aim of For America was support of political candidates sympathetic to the Nazi cause. 3 congressmen made up the recruiting arm of the organization: Burton K. Wheeler, Hamilton Fish, and Howard Buffett. Fish, the Republican Party leader, had as his greatest ambition the start of a third party based on principles of National Socialism. The others were already in disrepute for involvement in pro-Nazi, non-interventionist groups during the war. What will it take to disband this group? Asked the Atlanta Journal of this reincarnation of America First. World War III? Well, the next part brings in some of the military characters that are important to our story, especially as they will eventually touch base with my dad. General Wedemeyer's ultra-conservative Lonely Hearts Club Bund. In German, Bund is just club or, um, fellowship Bund. The Dr. Becker's Beltway Brotherhood. The war came marching home. The German military machine had been pounded to scrap in Europe and Japan, but the propaganda that fueled it resurfaced in San Antonio, Texas, and the proletariat, including veterans, greased the gears. The 1961 Let's Look at America campaign sponsored by the Fourth Army and the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce JCs, drew a crowd of 3,500 strong. Retired General Alfred Wedemeyer, a supporter of the John Birch Society, railed at President Kennedy's appeasement of the Soviet Union. Cleon Skousen, formerly an FBI agent and a scion of the Christian anti-communist crusade, demanded the end of all diplomatic relations with the Eastern Bloc. Dr. Gerhard Niemeyer, a writer for the National Review, spoke at the rally, and so did Senator Strom Thurmond and Donald Jackson of HUAC, that's the House Un-American Affairs Committee. The seminar spurned direct orders from the Pentagon, quote, a violation of Army policy. Army Secretary Elvis Stahat cautioned. Unmoved by orders, Colonel William Blythe of the 4th Army's G2 Division shot back, quote, we are not interested in politics. The Army intends to stand up and be counted, unquote. General Wedemeyer flew from the San Antonio session to Dallas, where he met with oil baron H.L. Hunt, a financial sponsor of Joseph McCarthy. A small battalion of military personalities threw in with a host of fascist front organizations, figureheads of the domestic war, among them Generals Nathan Twining, Admiral Radford, Rear Admiral Chester Ward of the Military Industrial Institute, Admiral Arleigh Burke, the featured speaker at the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, General Charles Willoughby, and General Peyton Campbell, General Stratemeyer, General Bonner Fellers, Admiral Strauss, and General Wedemeyer, and a blue ribbon coalition of military officers who joined forces with ultra-cons and Aryan nationals alike. Major General Charles A. Willoughby, born Adolf Scheppe Weidenbach, born in Heidelberg, Germany in 1892, Nazi agent in the Army Supreme Command and intelligence chief under MacArthur in Korea, quote, security director of the Shikshini Knights of Malta. Okay, another name that's interesting there is Otto Otepka, who was the head of the security department of the State Department when the Scarbeck case went down, and that's when McDuff, of course, was involved in that takedown of the only State Department employee ever convicted of treason. Now, General Charles A. Willoughby is the subject of a major part of this new book that I've got, and I'm still reading it. It's called Coup in Dallas, The Decisive Investigation into Who Killed JFK by H.P. Albarelli Jr., who did pass away about a year ago. And so the book was finished by two of his close associates. And I want to read from this book some of the section about Willoughby. So we've named this session tonight, our Mindfields is the real McCloy, Fritz Kraemer and the real McCloy. We'll get to Fritz Kraemer in a little bit, but the point about McCloy is he's the lawyer that is bringing in all of these Nazis and bringing them into U.S. policymaking positions, etc. This is the synarchy being brought into our country after World War II when we thought we won. But people like Willoughby, whose real name is Weidenbach, will prove to be doing their best to make sure that we lose. Let me get my book reading set up here. Now, you know that I personally am a fan of General MacArthur's. I don't base that on a great deal of study. I just kind of like his character and him, and the idea of having somebody that's heroic in our story is good. But on the other hand, we have to also recognize that he is one of those um, potential fascist thinking types. So where does he fall in our evaluation? We haven't got there yet, but let's just start here on page 246 of Coup in Dallas by H.P. Albarelli and learn a little bit about um, Douglas MacArthur's so-called intelligence chief, General Willoughby. In 1952, Douglas MacArthur had feigned reticence at the prospect of pursuing the Republican nomination for president. But when Texas oilman H.L. Hunt launched a MacArthur for president campaign and poured the equivalent in today's money of $1.5 million into the effort, MacArthur acquiesced. In spite of being a registered Democrat, Hunt recognized in the general all the qualities he required to promote his extreme conservative agenda. MacArthur eventually garnered 10 delegates at the Republican convention. Some might argue it was then that Texas oilman began to take stock of his political investments. On retirement, the general and his wife chose for their permanent residence in New York City a suite in the towers of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel that had been under management contract with the Texas hotelier Conrad Hilton since 1949. As such, over the years, MacArthur's needs would have been indulged by the Waldorf's managing director, Warren Brolia, whose Hotel Luma in Mexico City was identified early on in assassination research. As we learned, Brolia was known to have close friends within the U.S. intelligence apparatus, including June Cobb and Winthrop Buckingham, as mentioned previously. MacArthur's little fascist, Charles A. Willoughby. Whether his exact words were pet, lovable, or little fascist, MacArthur recognized that Charles Willoughby was a devotee of the political ideology that swept Europe and Latin America. In fact, it would be the driving force behind Willoughby's professional life in decades to come. Journalist Frank Kluckholm's fairly obscure coverage of the retired general in 1952 continued, quote, although Willoughby described his stay in Spain as being, quote, without official character, his initial audience with fascist dictator Franco lasted an hour and three quarters, extremely long for Franco audiences. During Willoughby's stay at the Velasquez Hotel, the Generalissimo was at great pains to provide him with government limousines and similar official amenities. During a lecture in the course which Willoughby described Spain as a cradle of Superman, he said, quote, I have come to Spain because I feel safer in Spain behind the Pyrenees than in Paris behind the Rhine. He neglected to explain why he wouldn't have felt even safer staying in New York behind the Atlantic, but this slur on NATO was obvious enough. After the departure from Spain in July, Willoughby remained in constant contact with Franco's ministers and Franco himself. Parentheses as a brief aside, Albarelli tells us that in the Lafitte records, quote, there is a page that goes into some bizarre Nazi-related rants to James Jesus Angleton about Spain that he says he will keep only to himself. The record includes the name of avowed Nazi sympathizer H. Keith Thompson, who assumed a role in the life of Lee Oswald's mother after the assassination and his murder. This episode was, I'm sorry, discussed in the previous chapter. Those who knew something of Willoughby's background were not greatly surprised at his paying sudden attention to Generalissimo Franco. John Gunther has reported that while he was gathering material for his book, The Riddle of MacArthur, He was at dinner one evening with Willoughby when the general suddenly proposed a toast to, quote, the second greatest military commander in the world, Francisco Franco, MacArthur obviously being the greatest. Willoughby once told a Madrid audience that the U.S. Army Command and General Staff School he had lectured at he had lectured in favor of Franco as early as 1936. Who was Major General Charles A. Willoughby, and why is his name found in CIA assassination files and in a dozen entries in the records of Pierre Lafitte? I should explain Pierre Lafitte is kind of the topic of Albarelli's book because it's a newly found diary that appears to be legitimate that includes a lot of names that need to be put together. I am reading the book as quickly as I can, but it's probably going to be another week or so before I can give you a full report on it. Let me skip ahead to some of the more interesting Willoughby stuff. Charles Willoughby was in frequent correspondence with the CIA's rising star Allen Dulles from the early 1950s. Writes Dick Russell, quote, in 1955, Willoughby's German connections were the subject of an exchange of correspondence with CIA Director Allen Dulles and Dulles's then deputy, Frank Wisner, who was in charge of relations with the Galen Network, as well as the American resettlement of several hundred ex-Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip. By now, Willoughby was living on Park Avenue in New York. I obtained the correspondence from among Willoughby's papers. Dulles to Willoughby, January 17, 1955. I appreciate your letter of 5 January and its interesting enclosures, which I have sent to some of my people for study. Also, many thanks for the interesting books which arrived separately. Regarding your idea of a trip to a certain country for the purpose of writing a book, I find this matter interesting and I shall be in touch with you further about it. March 17, 1955, Willoughby to Dulles. I believe in, quote, centralization, unquote, of intelligence. In a covert outfit, the command leadership is most important. I would be entirely satisfied to serve with or under you and have every conviction that CIA could not be in better or more responsible hands. On the book idea, I take the liberty of making certain suggestions. One, I am more interested in Europe or South America than in the Far East. Two, it is true that I have an exceptional entree in Spain. However, three, I can develop the same thing in Germany. My father's family, though a divorce took place, is unimpeachable in Wilhelminian society. This is an important point. Wilhelminian, that means Kaiser Wilhelm. These are the dead enders, I guess, of the German Empire. The last Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was deposed or supposedly abdicated, although I don't think he really did, at the end of the First World War. But realize he was the head of an empire, and all the people that depended upon him, well, they didn't want to just suddenly give up and go broke and turn in all their assets, so they stick together. And this Wilhelminian Prussians mainly, I think, is related to our Wilhelm, the mayor of New York, de Blasio, and also somehow all of the Kaiser stuff. The Kaisers, although David Underdown advises he hasn't made a direct connection, that seems to be it's probably going to be found. Okay, so now we know that Willoughby is dealing with Alan Dulles in the early and middle 50s. The correspondence between Dulles and Willoughby continued. Among Willoughby's myriad of associations, OSS officer Julius Amos, architect of leaderless resistance, is reflected in memos that crossed Dulles's desk. Okay, so here's a footnote for Bill Taylor and our Gibson Island crew. because Julius Amos was also Julia on Gibson Island, in context of those Gibson Island conferences. He is a real assassin, one who did a lot of work in Africa for um, dark forces. Julius Amos, Amoss. So here he is with associated with Willoughby, that is Weidenbach, the German who made it into MacArthur's intelligence department, becoming his intelligence chief, and may have been somebody that misled MacArthur. We don't know that yet, but it appears that he was in a position to perhaps do some treason against the Americans in World War II. Somebody that really probably had a Nazi orientation, we as the earlier reading was saying. People are oriented toward that thing that swept through Europe and Latin America, fascism. In October 1955, Willoughby offered the director aid in setting up promising social contacts between young American servicemen stationed in Germany and their counterparts, perhaps implementing Amos's theories. That means the leaderless resistance, and that involves cells and things. You can imagine that idea. The new generation has less to remember and to resent, Willoughby wrote to Dulles, suggesting that in American garrison towns in Germany, this approach can become the first step in developing a literary youth movement by utilizing existing clubs. From the viewpoint of social relations and youth indoctrination, Willoughby continued, it fits nearly, as you know, into one of the many facets of psychological warfare. In other words, indoctrinating kids to become fascists. It could become the medium by which we gain young adherents and partisans. Anyway, I'm going to try it. Willoughby, the ABN, and the Ukraine's OUN. Now, this is where I was really shocked that Willoughby was actually working with Stephen Bandera of the OUN. The ABN is a broader coalition of groups like the OUN, and those are the groups that found the Ukrainian resistance armies right now. So yeah, this is an ongoing thing. What Willoughby was a agent for the Synarchy and setting up, you know, youth indoctrination programs, as well as working with the Nazi collaborators, the ones that did the real horrible stuff for the Nazis. Professor Peter Dale Scott, poet, assassination expert, and author cited previously, was among the first to recognize the potential significance of an obscure figure in the saga of Lee and Marina Oswald named Spas T. Raikin. Raikin holds the dubious distinction of having been one of the first officials to have met Lee and Marina Oswald after they left the Soviet Union, where Lee had allegedly defected in 1959 and arrived by steamship in the harbor at Hoboken, New Jersey. Raikin told the Oswalds that he was a representative for the Travelers Aid Society and that he was there to assist them in any way he could. Interviewed by author Albarelli, Raikin said that he didn't tell the Oswalds that he held a high-ranking position with American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, the ABN. The ABN was strongly supported by Willoughby since its formation in Munich, Germany in 1946, confirming that SS Otto Skorzeny and General Charles Willoughby were at the very least aware of each other prior to Willoughby's trips to Spain that began in the early 50s, was their mutual associations with radical far-right Ukrainians. During World War II, leaders of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Yaroslav Stetsko and Stepan Bandera, had been held in the central Berlin prison at Spandau from September 15th, 1941 to January 1942. In June 1941, Stetko had announced the formation of a Ukrainian state, which was intended to align itself closely with the Nazis. Said Stetko, "We will closely cooperate with the National Socialist Greater Germany under the leadership of its leader Adolf Hitler, which is forming a new order in Europe and the world." By April 1944, Otto Skorzeny had sought out both Stetsko and Bandera, quote, to discuss plans for diversions and sabotage against the Soviet army. The two were released by the German authorities in September and, as planned with Skorzeny, began organizing the native populace to fight the advancing Soviet army. According to historian Stephen Doril, by 1946, the OUNB's secret police was conducting an assassination campaign in Western Germany. Ultimately, the OUN comprised the largest contingent within the anti Bolshevik bloc of nations, the ABN, which enjoyed significant support of General Charles Willoughby from its founding in 1946 in Munich. As may be suspected by some readers, the ABN was also strongly supported by the CIA, whose files are extensive on the group, as its correspondence with Allen Dulles between Allen Dulles and the ABN leaders. In fact, according to a CIA document dated 1957, Raikin was a contract agent for the CIA, having been cleared for hire by the Office of Security. The initial use of Raikin was in service of a project utilizing unwitting agents, but by 1960, Raikin was fully aware of his attachment to the agency. In the minds of fascist leaning politicians and power brokers in the US, Ukraine was the geographical bulwark against renewed Soviet aggression. Ultra right Ukrainians, Bandera and Stetsko, were the human face of that rabid anti communism. Now, this is next part is listen to this. It's really shocking to me. On October 15th, 1959, which coincidentally was the day Lee Oswald boarded a train from Helsinki to Moscow on the final leg of his defection, a 28-year-old KGB assassin, Bohdan Stashinsky, is alleged to have assassinated Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera in Munich. On trial in Munich in 1962, prosecutors presented the most persuasive version of the murder. Stashinsky had used a spray gun to disperse a lethal but undetectable poison that induced symptoms that mimicked heart attack. Did you hear that? This is what was talked about in the assassination hearings in 1975 and 76 with the Frank Church Committee. Was an assassination gun that could give you a heart attack undetectable. Well, 1959, a spray gun. Stashinsky had used a spray gun to disperse a lethal but undetectable poison that induced symptoms that mimicked heart attack. On Tuesday, September 12th, Pierre Lafitte made a note, spray gun to Willoughby-Shaw, Shaw, of course, being Clay Shaw, right? So are they going to get this spray gun to Clay Shaw through General Willoughby? Is that what this implies? The sheets from a ledger that author Al Borelli gained access to further indicate the significance of spray guns in Lafitte's world in 1963. As mentioned previously in one ledger entry, Lafitte notes, quote, Walker team, spray guns, at least 5. Another reads, quote, Rothermel says no on gas guns, but T says okay. Walker says yes, spray guns. Willoughby? Question mark. Wait a minute. Spray guns for what? Willoughby says We don't know whether he's okay with spray guns or not. 1959. This technology is not new. According to a recent book by professor of Ukrainian history, Serhiy Plokhy, The Man with the Poison Gun, a Cold War spy story, Stashinsky's career as a triggerman for the KGB played out against the backdrop of the fight for Ukrainian independence after the Second World War. Quote, Bohdan was a member of the underground resistance against the Soviet occupation, but was forced to become an informer for the secret police after his family was threatened. After he betrayed a resistance cell, he was ostracized by his family and was offered the choice of continuing his higher education, which he could no longer afford, or joining the secret police. Professor P.D. Scott was also the first to draw attention to the significance of the death of OUN's Stepan Bandera in the context of the assassination of President Kennedy. Bandera died at the hands of Soviet agent Bohdan Stashinsky. Scott notes that the assassination of Bandera was exploited by Ukrainian nationalists and ABN spokesmen to demonstrate the importance of the opposition of the OUN and the ABN to any rapprochement between the American and Soviet governments, which was being advanced during the Kennedy administration, especially the president's perceived conciliatory policies following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just 2 weeks before the assassination of President Kennedy, one of the three American pro Ukrainian spokesmen, former Representative Charles Kirsten of Wisconsin, who had served as a member of the steering committee of the World Anti Communist League, or WACL, WACL, quote, began to develop the picture of a Soviet assassin conspiracy. Kirsten had been researcher and assistant in the office of Senator McCarthy during the hearings. Scott also tells us that, quote, while in New Orleans in the late spring of 63, Oswald was linked to Americans who were in touch with the Latin American elements of Kirsten's steering committee of the WACL, including Morris Gatlin, who was involved with a right-wing group at the address used by Oswald for his Fair Play for Cuba committee. 2 years later, Dr. Nestor Prostic, the chairman of the American Friends of the ABN, a physician practicing in Buffalo, New York, was in direct communication with General Charles Willoughby. In his September 2nd, 1960 letter, Dr. Prostic tells Willoughby that he and Mr. Stetsko, that is, the Ukrainian rightist leader of the ABN and OUN, fully appreciated the retired general's noble efforts, unquote. A month later, Stetsko writes to Willoughby, directly under the letterhead of the Central Committee of the ABN, Süddeutsche Bank AG, Branch Munich. On March 18, 1963, retired director of the CIA Allen Dulles wrote to Major General Charles A. Willoughby on the letterhead of his Q Street address in D.C., rather than his New York office at 600 Fifth Avenue. The International Building in Rockefeller Plaza was shared by an impressive roster of American giants of industry, as well as small companies with interchangeable economic interests. Among them was Petroleum Resources, an entity with deep history in supplying the U.S. military during wartime. In the spring of 63, following his ouster from the agency after the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, and apparently feeling more relaxed in his communiques to General Willoughby, Dulles wrote, quote, enclosed is an advance of my Encyclopedia Britannica article on the craft of intelligence. Faithfully yours, Allen W. Dulles. Allen Dulles added a P.S. Let's discuss some concrete collaboration. We tried to get a hold of you, including Beadle Smith. The familiarity with which Dulles addresses Willoughby dispels any claim that his association had always been at arm's length. Willoughby responds with equal effusiveness on July 15th. Kennedy, Lafitte, who was embroiled in tracking the process of what appears to be preliminary plans to assassinate Kennedy, had already mentioned Willoughby in his date book on 6 dates. In the letter to Dulles, Willoughby apologizes for the delay in responding and suggests to Dulles a thorough review of in his own uh, paper, the Foreign Intel Digest. Well, then he goes to Switzerland. So here's the deal. Willoughby is obviously doing some behind the scenes work that supports the people that are putting together the assassination. So, and the whole idea of the Ukraine being the center of the resistance against the Soviet Union planned in 1946 is playing out right now today. So is it not, the same people? It's the descendants of the same people. It is this synarchy. And now let's go over to our article on Fritz Kraemer. Sorry, I'm running out of time, but let's go ahead and do this. It'll just take 5 minutes. This is from the Times of Israel, a blog written August 12th, 2013 by Hubertus Hoffmann. Kissinger's Kissinger, Dr. Fritz Kraemer. Dr. Fritz Kraemer was the most influential German in the Pentagon from 1952 to 1978. So that certainly covers my dad's era. Geostrategic advisor to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in the U.S. Department of Defense. The true Dr. Strangelove, complete with monocle and walking stick. A last Prussian on the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. So now you can picture Kraemer. He's a Prussian with the monocle and the walking stick. A German immigrant to the U.S. born in Essen in 1908 with a Christian denomination but Jewish roots. Where have we seen that before, Attorney General Barr? Kraemer, an intellectual with 2 PhDs, scraped a living as a farm worker for 5 years. In 1944, he was conscripted and thus became a U.S. citizen. Kraemer discovered and mentored 2 U.S. Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. In 1944, he met the 19-year-old soldier Henry Kissinger, who had also emigrated from Germany. He formed, as Kissinger's Kissinger, his thinking and world outlook and fought with him in the 84th U.S. Infantry Division for the liberation of Europe. Not sure how much fighting they did. Kissinger himself writes about it in his new book, True Keeper of the Holy Flame. In the new book, True Keeper of the Holy Flame, by Hubertus Hoffmann, who is the author of this blog. Kraemer placed young Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig with newly appointed National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger in the White House. The later U.S. Secretary of State described how this was possible in his contribution to the book. Fritz Kraemer saw himself as a missionary of freedom and a mentor for unknown young talents who should take over responsibility for their country as a new elite. Quote, unquote, a new elite. Just what we need. All men are created equal except for the elites. Yes, that's the way it works at Animal Farm. He was co-founder of the American School of Thought, Peace Through Strength, a critic of moral relativism and of a fearful and weak bourgeoisie who, according to him, do not understand the imminence of the threat from totalitarian radicals and most times shy away from it. As a young boy, Kraemer experienced the German Empire. As student, the Weimar Republic and the rise of Adolf Hitler. From 1944, he fought for the liberation of his homeland from totalitarianism with the United States Army. In the Pentagon, he became the Gray Eminence during the Cold War, an authority on Germany and an educator of high-ranking officers and politicians. He always remained a true Prussian inside his heart and stood by his strong principles of a freedom fighter. He passed away in 2003 and was buried with full military honors at the Arlington National Cemetery. His former pupil, Henry Kissinger, delivered the eulogy, with whom he had not spoken since the 1970s. Hubertus Hoffman, in his new book, explains for the first time why Kraemer and Kissinger split. His master pupil and former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, quote, Fritz Kraemer was the greatest single influence on my formative years, an extraordinary man who will be part of my life as long as I draw breath. His protege, former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, quote, for me, Dr. Kramer's lifetime of service confirms the importance of the nation's elites. Hello, elites. In pursuing and advancing the value of a free society. I can think of no individual whose patient tutelage made a more meaningful contribution to the shaping of my own worldview. U.S. President Richard Nixon, whom he briefed with Kissinger in the Oval Office in 1972, quote, I like him and read his stuff. I appreciate to have an intelligent appraisal by someone who really understands great forces at work in the world. The futurologist Herman Kahn, that's Kahn, of the Hudson Institute, writes, quote, if there is anyone who has stood for the good and the true, it is Fritz Kraemer. He knows what he stands for and says what he stands for, unquote. Henning Hubertus Baron von Steuben puts Fritz Kraemer alongside one of his ancestors, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the first Inspector General of the U.S. Army under George Washington, quote, Steuben and Kraemer have, at the intervals of 2 centuries, put their mark on the United States Army as officers through their deeply rooted Prussian values, such as integrity, honor, discipline, and duty for their homeland, and coined the United States Army with their spirit, unquote. We need a fresh, responsible elite in our democracies. They must assume key functions in our society. It is not about privilege or wealth, but about special responsibility. We should seek out men and women of excellence, support them permanently as mentors, instruct, and encourage them. Too few personalities dedicate themselves to this task. They rather rally simple celebrities than care for unknown young talents. Our bourgeois society is idle and coward at heart. It does not recognize the imminence of the few determined radicals or only do when it is too late. The youth should not get lost in materialism, but stay true to themselves. A fulfilled life requires idealism, not materialism. We need true individualism, striving against the stream, courage, and self discipline. Develop into a person with good character, iron will, courage, and much energy. Character counts, not position and title. Think about everything over and over again. Become an independent, strong personality, like a tower of strength. Change the reality instead of passively adapting to it. Fight for the good and against the harassment of human dignity and liberty. Take over responsibilities and do not ask what you get back from it. In the extensive concluding chapter of the book, True Keeper of the Holy Flame, The Legacy of Pentagon Strategist and Mentor Dr. Fritz Kraemer, Dr. Hubertus Hoffman, due to Kramer's teaching and his own longtime experience as advisor in the German and European Parliament, and as president of the independent World Security Network Foundation, calls for a more efficient and fresh foreign policy and security policy labeled World 3.0. It is based on the classic foreign policy World 1.0, defined by power politics as described by German-born geostrategists Henry Kissinger or Hans J. Morgenthau. Mark has a show at 9 o'clock, so I'm running out of time to do what I wanted to do was to wrap all these things together and to say with a Fritz Kraemer, you see at the top the roots that are still strong of Nazism. You hear the elite in his personality, and you understand that that monocle and that walking stick stand for the totalitarian leadership that he claims to want to fight against, because his way of fighting is with elite resources and not with the common people. And when he talks about freedom, he's talking about freedom for the elites to do as they will, and not freedom for the common person. So this is, I think, where you reach out into the Pacific theater with Willoughby and the European theater with Kramer. You have the Nazi Skorzeny becoming a mercenary for the Synarchy after the war, working in Spain and Latin America and in the United States. This goes back a long way, and the traditions of elite rule are still there. Will they prevail? They're allied, certainly, with the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg Group, and all the usual suspects. So let's keep our eyes on the ball and not let them get away with it. We are the vanguard. We've got to keep the flame of freedom alive.